Hello and welcome. My name is Elliot Stein. I'm a senior litigation analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence covering the financial sector. As you probably are aware, last night was President Biden's State of the Union address. And given the importance of the speech and the policies outlined by the president, we thought it would be helpful to get a roundtable of our litigation and policy analysts who cover Washington to get their thoughts on what investors should be taken away from the speech last night. We're recording this on March 8th. Friday, the speech again was last night, March 7th. Joining me today are my colleagues Dwayne Wright and Nathan Dean and Matt Settenhelm in Washington, D.C., and Andrew Silverman in New York. They cover healthcare, financials, TMT, and tax, respectively. Just a quick note before we jump into the substance, you can always access our 2024 election coverage, as well as our litigation and policy matrices and our other litigation and policy research on our dashboard on the Bloomberg terminal by typing in BI laws, BI space laws, go. All right, so we want to keep this sort of short, so we'll jump right into the content. Dwayne, let's bring you in to talk healthcare first. What are your takeaways from the speech last night? I know President Biden spoke a fair amount about Medicare drug pricing and negotiations there, as well as the ACA. So what should investors be thinking about?
Yeah, so thanks, Elliot. I think the main takeaway for me is that even in a all Democratic Congress, if that happens after the election, Biden's goal of bringing in more drugs subject to negotiation is probably pretty far-fetched. Now, just as a baseline understanding, right now in the IRA, 10 drugs are subject for the first year beginning 2026, 15 Part D drugs 2027, 15 Part B and D drugs in 2028, and then 20 thereafter. Biden proposed going up to 50 per year. It's worth remembering that this is something Biden proposed last year. His first address with a Republican Congress, our House of Representatives. If that was even plausible, it would have happened when the IRA was passed. Democrats decided that going above what is already in the law was too much. And this wasn't a Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema thing. I think that's the initial reaction people have, keeping in mind both are not running for re-election. This was coming from other Democrats who did not want to go as aggressively on the drug pricing front. So a lot of Democrats, moderate Democrats, representing districts with the life science interests. So even in a best case scenario for President Biden, where he gets reelected and gets a Democratic House, I don't see a pathway for even more aggressive measures on the drug pricing front. So I think it's a status quo on the IRA with potential regulatory changes in terms of interpretation of the law. So I think it's a good talking point for the president because he's now in a general election rematch with an opponent who wants to repeal the law. And it's keeping the focus on one of his favorite issues, which is drug pricing and the fact that he actually did something unlike the previous president. Now, Biden also talked about Affordable Care Act subsidies and what he should or Congress should be doing there. Now, just to back up a bit, the IRA included a provision that enhanced or improved some of the subsidies to make it more affordable for individuals, essentially making the premiums low or no cost for individuals. That provision has been a catalyst for ACA enrollment reaching records. It's now 21.3 million as of the beginning of this year. There are some other things that are in play, such as the Medicare redetermination process that's also contributing. But by and large, because these plans are a lot more affordable for individuals. We've seen the spike in enrollment, and this is benefiting companies like Centene, which has about a third of its revenue come from the marketplace, United Health, which is in about 26, 27 states, CVS, which is expanding, and Molina as well. The challenge for Democrats is those enhanced subsidies will expire at the end of 2025. The expectation is, or the concern had been, if these subsidies are not extended, you could see a pretty significant cliff because people would disenroll or not enroll in a CA plan because it would no longer be affordable. So that is the issue facing Democrats and people who are benefiting from this plan. Now, the question will be, how does this happen? How does the extension happen after 2025? This probably gets wrapped up into a broader conversation of what to do with the Trump tax cuts, which are also expiring, and then how to afford it all. Pre-IRA, when enrollment in the ACA was not as high, it was about $20 billion a year for these enhanced subsidies. It's probably higher now because of higher enrollment. So if you multiply that by 10, we're talking about $200 billion over a 10-year period. It's quite a bit of money. So my expectation is at some point we'll probably see that extension, but it will largely hinge on what happens with the election and whether or not Republicans or Democrats are in control of the House. So a lot at stake for this provision, and we'll know more about the potential outlook after November.
Great, thanks a lot, Dwayne. All right, let's move to financials. Nathan, let's bring you in. I know the president mentioned rescheduling of marijuana. What exactly does that mean, and what does that mean for companies in that space?
Yeah, so this was actually a fairly significant statement. I mean, it was only 12 words associated with it, and all the president said is that I've directed my cabinet to look at the rescheduling of marijuana. Marijuana is currently a Schedule 1 drug, which puts it on par with heroin and cocaine. And there's this thought out there that it will move to Schedule 3. Think of Tylenol with codeine. Now, in terms of rescheduling, the reason why it's so important is because it's an action that the president and therefore his administration can do and bypass Congress. Now, the reason why we talk about this in the financial space is that there is a bill out there called the Safe Banking Act, which will allow banks to service marijuana businesses. And it's like one of the few legislative attempts for marijuana-related issues that could pass. Now, we don't think it's going to pass, but in result, you begin to see the marijuana equities, like if you look at the MSOS ETF, for example, these equities almost respond 15 to 20% in response to political actions, and then maybe the day or two they go down. And we like to say that they have hot sauce just because of the volatility of these stocks. Now, President Biden, what he said last night was important, but look, we've already known that they were looking at this. But I would say it's extremely important that the president said this because it's not like the president accepts every single issue to mention in his State of the Union, and yet he decided to put 12 words to it. I think that means that we're going to have an extremely high chance that the reschedulization will happen. I was 70% odds before the State of the Union. I put out a note this morning. I've moved that up to 80%. And I think that's going to happen in the next few months, potentially even like April 20th. You know, Washington wants to be a little funny around that date. So, but don't be surprised if it happens. Now, if reschedulization does happen, it's not legalization. It's not decriminalization. For a lot of these marijuana equities, the biggest thing is called 280E tax relief. Now, I would tell you all the great things about 280E tax relief, but it just so happens we have the tax guru for BI here on the virtual roundtable. So I'm just going to shoot it over to Andrew and he'll explain it better than I can.
Yeah, sure. So 280E prevents companies from being able to take their ordinary and necessary deductions. And so what that means is that it typically makes marijuana companies have effective tax rates about up to 80% or so, and they're barred from deducting about 45% of their business expenses. So moving marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 or taking it off the scheduling of the Controlled Substances Act, generally speaking, would allow them to deduct those expenses and act more like a normal corporation, and it would be really a game changer for marijuana companies.
Great, thanks, guys. All right, let's Nathan, let's go back to you. But let's move to credit card late fees, which President Biden spoke about in the speech last night, which is not a surprise since the CFPB just finalized its rules on credit card late fees a couple days earlier. And that rule would cut the typical credit card late fees that average Americans pay to $8 from $32. I want you to give us a sense of what that means for credit card issuers, put some numbers around that. But I think before you even get there, I should just add that, we had our first lawsuit filed against this rule yesterday, pretty late yesterday. And I took a look at that and I put out a note this morning, and I think it's very likely that this rule is going to get struck down in court. It was filed in federal court in Texas. As most people know, that's in the Fifth Circuit. But even before it gets to the Fifth Circuit, which is a very favorable appeals court for groups that challenge administrative rules, they're before a trial court judge who is also extremely conservative and concerned about government overreach. So, the lawsuit was filed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and then several banking trade groups, and they really got a good judge. And I think they have good arguments as well, primarily that the CFPB didn't consider several factors that they should have considered when trying to come up with a proportional and reasonable late fee. The CFPB really focused on pre-charge-off collection costs, but the statute really requires them to also look at all costs beyond just pre-charge-off collection costs, including post-charge-off collection costs. And then also the CFPB should have considered the deterrent effect in coming up with its safe harbor for late fees. And then also it should have considered the conduct of the cardholder. So I think the CFPB is on very thin ice. But having said all that, I'll have you chime in, Nathan, on more about what the president spoke about last night. But I really do think this rule is never going to see the light of day.
Yeah, so if Elliott's wrong, and look, he's not going to be wrong, but if Elliott's wrong, this rule could take around $10.9 billion in credit card issuer late fees, and they would dry up almost instantly because of that $32 down to $8. Now, who does this impact? Well, it's all credit card issuers, like even going from like Capital One and Discover and Bank of America and so forth. But CFPB analysis in the past has found that the private label card issuers, the ones, think of your Nordstrom's card or your Sears card, and I don't know if Sears even exists anymore, but think of those types of cards, and you have firms like Bread Financial and Synchrony are the ones that are actually issuing those credit cards. And they tend to have more exposure to late fees than the big other issuers that do a lot of just the random Visa and MasterCards that people use. So, the other thing I would just keep in mind is that this wasn't a new initiative. When President Biden last night in his speech talked about junk fees, these are things that he talked about 2-3 years ago. And the credit card space is just one of many. He mentioned transportation, tickets, airlines, and so forth like that. So as continued work, and this would especially happen if President Biden wins a second term, there is a council over at the White House called the White House Competition Council that was established by a executive order from several years ago. And this CFPB credit card late fee is just one of many things that are going on at the Competition Council. So if President Biden does win a second term, definitely expect more work here to commence.
Great, thanks, Nathan. All right, Matt, let's bring you in and turn to tech. I'm pretty sure I heard the president mention AI in terms of videos, I believe. And he also talked a fair bit about the CHIPS Act and infrastructure investments, which is not a surprise since that was a major legislative achievement. But what are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah. So not a lot on tech in the speech, but a couple things to note and be aware of. AI got, I think, 2 sentences near the end of the speech about the promise and peril, and then a note about voice impersonation, and then trying to outlaw or ban that. That's something the FCC has already taken a look at with respect to robocalls. I think the FTC is also looking at it as well. But generally, look, Congress and the whole federal government is sort of at a stage of still trying to understand AI. And we've seen a number of sort of listening sessions where Congress is trying to figure this out, trying to understand the risks. We've seen an executive order from the administration. And so I think now we're sort of slowly moving towards light touch guardrails from the administration. I'm not sure we're going to get there this year, but I think his speech was consistent with that. On the CHIPS Act, on semiconductors, I think that was mostly a victory lap from the president. We had said in 2022 that this $39 billion subsidy bill was likely to pass, and it did pass. Now we are awaiting the administration's doling out of that money. That's going to happen over the next 6 months. And we said, look for Intel, TSMC, and Samsung to among others, to benefit from that. So very little visibility in how that's going to be doled out, but that's coming in the next months. What you didn't hear from Biden is any talk about CHIPS 2 or something to build upon that in the next administration. That's something to keep an eye on, but not something that he brought up yesterday as a priority for his next term. I think the last thing I'll mention is data privacy. Again, got a mention from President Biden at the end of his speech, and is specifically with respect to kids. And this is about the 3rd time he's mentioned it in a State of the Union without it actually moving. But the thing to watch here, there's a handful of bills in the Senate Judiciary Committee that I don't think are all that material that are likely to move. But there's one bill that's called KOSA, the Kids Online Safety Act, that has over 60 Senate co-sponsors, and I think it has a fairly good shot to become law this year. When Biden mentioned this last night, this was one of those where Speaker Johnson almost halfway started to clap. And so it may be a sign that you might see some support even in the House. I think this is likely to clear the Senate. And so I think there's a real chance that does pass. And that could be, it's certainly going to impose costs on Meta and Google with respect to complying with the new law. It could discourage young people from using the service over time. And it's trying to mitigate the harms to youth from using social media. And I think that does present some long-term risks to the company. So I think that's the issue to keep your eye on most immediately from a tech perspective.
Good, thanks, Matt. All right, last but certainly not least, Andrew, let's bring you in to talk taxes. The president certainly talked quite a bit about corporate tax rates and the fairness of the tax code. What should investors be taking away, do you think, from last night's speech?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'd like to set the scene a little bit. So many of the cornerstones of the 2018 GOP Tax Reform Act, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, expire in 2026, as Dwayne mentioned, and that's caused corporate effective tax rates to creep up because some of the pay-fors and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts have been phasing out. And the House voted overwhelmingly to pass a bipartisan tax compromise that reverses out a lot of those pay-fors temporarily in return for a slightly boosted child tax credit. But that bill is now stalled in the Senate and looks to be in trouble. So what the Republicans have said is if they win in November, they would make the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent. And if possible, they would go even further and cut corporate tax rates even more, cut individual tax rates, reduce capital gains rates, things like that. And so it's in this landscape that the president is offering what I think are very sort of populist tax proposals. And I group them into 3 main categories. So looking back, here's what we've done with the Inflation Reduction Act and how it differs from the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And then looking forward, what sorts of things he wants to do in the future: corporate tax increases, higher taxes on the very wealthy. He talks about his policies positioning the United States for the future, and Trump's policies is sort of looking backward, right? He talks about trickle-down economics, that term from the 1980s, or voodoo economics. And he says that his policies look forward. Why? Because the TCJA, he says, incentivizes offshoring. And he says the IRA, on the other hand, although he doesn't mention the Inflation Reduction Act specifically, he says that he's created American jobs. And that's probably because of the caveats in the Inflation Reduction Act that prevent those credits from being taken if materials aren't sourced from the United States and production is in the United States. And then he says, do rich corporations really need the credits the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has given them, or wouldn't you rather have what I've offered? And Biden makes a distinction between big corporations and small businesses, and he talks about big corporations deserving a 21% minimum tax rate and restrictions on things like executive pay and tax breaks for the use of the corporate jet, and repealing tax perks to big oil and big pharma. And I think he sort of implies that those tax changes wouldn't apply to smaller businesses, to essentially individuals. And what's so interesting about that 21% minimum tax rate, he doesn't say this per se, but it would probably bring the United States within the restrictions for what the OECD has proposed, or the EU has proposed, for a global minimum tax. So that's sort of a backdoor way of bringing the United States into the rest of the world, something that Biden has promised and Congress hasn't followed through on. And he also said that he would get rid, he would sort of equalize Social Security withholding tax from the wealthy and everybody else. And what does that mean? Well, the Social Security tax, payroll withholding tax, caps out at $168,000 in 2024. It's a 12.5% tax, half shouldered by employees, half by employers. And he says that the wealthy should pay their share. So it sounds almost like he would get rid of that cap, and then that 12.5% tax would be, applied in full to everything that employees are making, all employees. And he also makes a distinction between the middle class, and he talks about the wealthy sort of being in that middle class. Anybody who makes below $400,000, close to that $400,000 is wealthy, but not super wealthy. And then he talks about the very wealthy, billionaires, and he talks about how they should have a 25% tax rate, but which is kind of interesting actually, because they already pay a 37% tax rate, and there's an individual AMT that applies at a 26% rate and a 28% rate. So it's not exactly clear what he's talking about. Is he talking about carried interest? Is he talking about capital gains applied at a 20% rate? Is he talking about estate and gift tax? It's really sort of unclear. And then the last major thing that he brought up was this $400 monthly credit for homeowners, and I think that's sort of an appeal to millennials and Gen Z, those that can't afford to buy a home these days. And interestingly, I think that group of people was also sort of being appealed to by the Republicans. If you saw the response that was being given from that senator's kitchen in her home, so really sort of talking about home ownership and why it's so important. Interestingly, what he didn't talk about was clean energy tax credits, carbon taxes, sort of the things that he talked about in past State of the Union addresses. And of course, he also didn't talk about how he would get these things adopted. And that's really sort of unclear. Would he get 50 seats in the Senate and pass it by reconciliation? Would he is he expecting to get 60 seats in the Senate and a large majority in the House, and that's how he's going to pass it? Is he thinking it's all going to be bipartisan? That's very sort of unclear. So lots to look for in the coming days, and a lot of things that he talked about on the tax front. And so it was very exciting night for tax folks like me.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. All right. I think we'll leave it there. We'll let everyone get back to their day and have a great weekend. And thank you for listening.